Spider-Man Far From Home was the 9th Spider-Man movie released, that is if you include Venom, and these movies vary in quality immensely over the years. In this video, I will rank and also give a short review for all 9 of these movies, and keep in mind that this is 100% opinionated, so if you disagree with this list, which I feel like most of you probably will because everybody has their own unique list, don't shy away from leaving your list in the comments down below. With that out of the way, let's just begin the list with number 9. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is a really stupid movie. I don't dislike Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man, but he's certainly not the best live-action version of the character, and while I do like the relationship between Peter and Gwen, there isn't really anything else in the movie at all that is necessarily good. There are way too many villains, and the villains we get are just terrible. Electro is extremely over the top, with quite possibly the stupidest motivation in all of these movies for any of the villains. The Green Goblin in this movie isn't really much better, with an equally ridiculous motivation, equally over the top, and he just looks really stupid. And also, why is he Harry Osborn and not Norman Osborn? And also, there's the Rhino, who's probably the worst of them all, barely getting any screen time, being way too over the top, and just an all-around terrible villain. This series decided to focus on Peter's parents, which I'll never understand why they did that. It's a pointless storyline that serves no purpose and goes nowhere, which really brings down the series, especially this movie, more than the first one. In the end, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is a really stupid movie, and definitely the worst Spider-Man movie to date.
Will always come at a cost.
Venom is a little less stupid than The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but I still really don't like it. My main problem is that just the actual concept of the movie I think is so flawed. It should never have existed. The fact that this version of Eddie Brock became Venom before Spider-Man got the black suit, and Venom never met a Spider-Man, or also became a hero, or I guess an anti-hero, before being a Spider-Man villain, it just doesn't make any sense. It wouldn't really fit into any Spider-Man universe. On top of that, Riot is a pretty bad villain. The fight scenes are pretty bad. Like they just don't look good at all, and this movie really could have used an R rating. Whenever they shy away from Venom killing somebody, it's really noticeable. I think this movie is fun, and I acknowledge it has its fans, but the flawed concept and the really bad villain makes this movie pretty mediocre. Also, I don't think this Venom has a good enough design. I think his design is not nearly as good as Venom's design in Spider-Man 3, which came out, 11 years before this one, which is really, really bad. Speaking of Spider-Man 3...
This could be the end of Spider-Man.
Spider-Man 3 is known to be the worst Spider-Man movie in the trilogy, or at least the original one, and while I do agree, I really don't think it's that much worse than the first two. I'll be honest, I'm not a fan of Tobey Maguire in the role of Peter Parker, and especially Spider-Man, and these movies hold no nostalgia for me whatsoever, except for maybe Spider-Man 3 a little bit, but even that, it's barely anything. Like, the only Spider-Man movie that I think has any nostalgia for me is The Amazing Spider-Man, the original one. I think for the original trilogy, it was just nothing there. I think that Spider-Man 3 is definitely visually and CGI-wise the best movie in the trilogy, but that's about it. There are way too many villains, and while I don't think any of the villains are terrible, like in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, none of them are that great either. I really don't like the relationship between MJ and Peter, like especially in this movie, even more so than the original two, and while this movie isn't great, prepare for the other two movies in the trilogy to also maybe be lower than you might have expected for this list. The original Spider-Man is definitely a product of its time. It was an amazing start to the superhero movie phenomenon, along with X-Men in the early 2000s, but so many much better superhero movies have come around since, making this movie look a lot worse in comparison. The CGI and the fight scenes are really bad and really dated, and I'm pretty sure they were even bad for the time. Tobey Maguire, I really don't like him as Peter Parker. Maybe not terrible as Peter Parker, but he is a genuinely horrible Spider-Man. Despite the pretty good suit that he has in these movies, I think Tobey Maguire is just not good in the role. overall. Willem Dafoe is certainly doing a good job here as Norman Osborn, but the Green Goblin's design, motivation, and overall plan is pretty stupid. So overall, this might be a controversial opinion, but I really think that the original Spider-Man trilogy, and especially the original Spider-Man, is very dated, and at this point is really just not as good as people say anymore. And an even more controversial opinion than that, Spider-Man 2 is certainly less dated than Spider-Man, and it's definitely the best in the trilogy, but it's still a product of its time. Tobey Maguire is still not good in the role, and while the fight scenes aren't terrible, with the train fight actually being pretty good, the visuals are still not very good at all. It's definitely a little bit dated. Dr. Octopus, I don't think, is a very good villain with a nonsensical motivation and a nonsensical plan, and while the actor did a good job, I still think this is not a good version of Dr. Octopus, especially compared to what we got a lot later in Spider-Man PS4. This movie is typically praised for, or at least partially for, the Spider-Man No More storyline, which I'll admit is handled pretty well and is probably my favorite part of the movie, which is why it's maybe a little bit higher than the other movies in the trilogy, but I still think it's pretty dated and also not as good as people say, and it's definitely not the pinnacle of superhero movies that a lot of people say that it is, and I think that there are a lot of other Spider-Man movies, specifically 4 of them, that are either a little bit or 3 of them being a lot better. The Amazing Spider-Man came out when I was 11 years old, and at the time, I absolutely loved it. It was my favorite movie of all time at the time, and it was honestly the movie that got me into being a fan of Spider-Man. That being said, looking back, it's certainly not as good as I remember, and it definitely has its flaws, but out of all the Spider-Man movies, it definitely holds the most nostalgia for me, and it's really the only Spider-Man movie that does. I think that this movie has some great fight scenes. I really like Peter and Gwen's relationship, and I think Kurt Connors, before becoming a lizard, is a great character and a great antagonist with a great motivation, but that is until he does turn into a lizard and wants to turn the city into lizards, which really ruins the character, and I really don't like that they did that. Also, this movie focuses on Peter's parents, like the second one, for no reason. Like I said, it goes nowhere. It's such a stupid thing that they focus on. There are a lot of stupid moments and scenes, and there's a lot about both Peter Parker and Spider-Man this movie gets really, really wrong, like Peter Parker being a lot cooler than he should be before becoming Spider-Man, and Spider-Man being pretty much an asshole for a big part of the movie, but I genuinely think that this movie is a little better than the Spider-Man trilogy because it's not dated and it holds a level of nostalgia for me that those movies do not. These last 3 movies, however, are pretty neck and neck, and they are so much better than the movies I've gone over since that it's crazy that they all came out in the last 2 years, starting with...
Because I will kill you and everybody you love.
Spider-Man Homecoming was, in my opinion, the first great Spider-Man movie ever made. Tom Holland is just perfect in the role of both Peter Parker and Spider-Man, both versions of that, Peter Parker and Spider-Man, being a lot better than the Tobey Maguire's versions of both those characters, or those 2 personas, as well as Andrew Garfield's versions. This movie is hilarious and really gets Spider-Man a lot better than any movie come before it. The fight scenes are great, and Adrian Toomes, also known as the Vulture, was at the time my favorite Spider-Man villain, and also my favorite MCU villain for a while. Obviously not anymore because Thanos has come around since, but he's still a great villain with a solid motivation, great acting from Michael Keaton, making him pretty scary at times, and definitely an interesting threat for Spider-Man that really fits into the MCU, which really enhances this movie. I love Spider-Man Homecoming, and it was the first Spider-Man movie that I thought was genuinely great, so it's crazy that in the last 2 years, there were 2 movies that came out that were starring Spider-Man, or did star Spider-Man, that were even better.
It's the next Iron Man.
You going to step up or not?
Spider-Man Far From Home is a little better than Homecoming. Tom Holland is still perfect as both Peter and Spider-Man, and just like in Homecoming, these movies really understand the character. That being said, the reason this is even better than Homecoming is mostly because of the outstanding visuals. I've stated before that Spider-Man Far From Home is the best movie in the MCU in terms of the visuals, and I 100% stand by that statement. This movie looks incredible, from the fight scenes to the swinging scenes to especially the illusion scenes. The visuals in those illusion scenes were insane. They were jaw-droppingly insane. That, plus the outstanding villain in Quentin Beck, also known as Mysterio, makes this, in my opinion, the best live-action Spider-Man movie ever, and the only reason it isn't number one is because there were a couple things in the movie I don't love. While the number one slot on this list doesn't really have any flaws and is also a visual masterpiece, I'm of course talking about...
None of us will have a home to go home to.
Remember, what makes you different?
Let's go!
Is what makes you Spider-Man.
Officer,
I love you.
Wait, what?
I had a hard time deciding which should be number one. Far From Home, SpiderVerse, or even Homecoming. Like I said, these three movies are pretty neck and neck, and it wasn't easy deciding which one would be better than the other, but I decided that Into the Spider-Verse is actually the best out of the three. Like I said, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is visually incredible with its unique animation, making everything feel like it was ripped straight out of a comic book, and that is awesome. The fight scenes look incredible, and the movie just looks great overall. Spider-Verse does the impossible by introducing a whole new world. Not only that, a whole new multiverse for the first time ever, while also juggling a whole slew of different Spider-Men, but also telling a pretty personal story starring Miles Morales, which is kind of mind-boggling, and how they pulled off everything, which is, it makes it so damn satisfying when Miles finally gets his Spider-Man suit and takes the leap of faith that is mentioned earlier in the movie. The fact that they pulled that off, it's incredible. Kingpin, I don't think is an amazing villain. That's the only part of this movie that I don't think is as good as Far From Home or Homecoming if you villain, but I still also don't think that really takes away much from the movie, as Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is maybe not without a doubt, it's pretty close, but at this point is the best Spider-Man movie ever made, putting it at number one on this list, but Far From Home and Homecoming are not very far behind in my opinion. Also, I want to mention that if I were to include Spider-Man PS4, which is not a movie at all, which is why I'm not including it, but if I were, because it is a visual media and it really feels like a movie, it would be number one. It's such a great story. I've never played it myself, or I have played it, but I never played the story myself, but I have watched it, and it's so good. There's such a great villain in Dr. Octopus. It's very emotional. I think, honestly, the relationship between Peter and Mary Jane is so much better than any of the relationships in any of the movies, so I think that Spider-Man PS4 would be the number one slot on this list. It's not a movie, so I'm not including it, but if I were to include it, it would be number one. But what is your list? Let me know in the comments down below, and what do you think about mine? Obviously, I have some controversial opinions, for instance, mainly putting the Amazing Spider-Man over the entirety of the Spider-Man trilogy, and I'm sure it's also a little bit controversial for some people to put the Spider-Man trilogy under the newest Spider-Man movies, like Spider-Man Homecoming, Far From Home, and not really Into the Spider-Verse, but definitely the MCU movies. There are a lot of Spider-Man trilogy fans that are not really fans of the MCU movies, which I don't get. I honestly don't understand that, but everyone can have their own opinion, so let me know your list in the comments down below. If you like this video, make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe, and check out my review for Spider-Man Far From Home, and thanks for watching.